What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Football Goons podcast. We're glad you've joined us again this week as we finish up our 2018 Fantasy Football Rankings series. Our rankings are going to continue to update from now until the beginning of the season, so you want to make sure you're checking those out at footballgoons.com. But this will be the last podcast specifically giving detailed breakdowns at the position. Tonight, we're going to talk about the tight end position. And because there's not a ton to really discuss at the tight end position, we're also going to get some average draft position trend discussion going and some fantasy football Q&A. So if you're joining us live on YouTube here, or if you've connected with us, facebook.com/footballgoons, or on the Twitter @footballgoons, you can send us in your questions, fantasy football related. Doesn't have to be about tight ends. It could be about your draft, something that you have on your mind. But we want your questions tonight for the show, and we're going to answer quite a few of them near the end of the show here tonight. So we're going to get right into it, guys. We've just completed the last week without football until early February of 2019. So
sounds fantastic.
I know everybody in this conversation is excited about it. I know the fantasy football community is as well. But we got to touch on something real quick. Big news, July 29. It is our guy Rocco's birthday.
Yeah.
So happy birthday. He's feeling 25, not quite feeling 22, but feeling 25, he told us.
I'm not even feeling 25 at this point. Oh, man. It feels 34 feels just about as awful as 33 did, at least for right now.
Yeah, well, we didn't want the show to go by without wishing our guy Rocco a happy birthday. You could jump on social media and do the same as well. Wish him a happy birthday. I know he'd be pumped to get the shout out from you guys out there. So let's talk about
in advance.
Yeah, let's talk about tight ends. All right. It's a position where, you're really not looking to get too deep dive into it because everybody's going to own one. The occasional owner is going to have two. If you can flex one or super flex or use one in that capacity, you might be interested there. But we're going to talk about our top 12 because, we feel like that basically covers off on what needs to be discussed. So here's ours. Top 12 in order. We've got Travis Kelce, Rob Gronkowski, Zach Ertz, Evan Ingram, Jimmy Graham, Greg Olsen, Kyle Rudolph, Trey Burton, Delaney Walker, Jordan Reed, Tyler Eifert, and Jack Doyle are our top 12. So overwhelmingly here, most of the outlets out there are close to that same top 12. Maybe a different order. We're kind of bucking the trend of having Gronk as number one with Kelce being there. So I'll ask this question. Under what circumstance would you be one of the first owners to take a tight end in your draft?
I'm going to be honest with you guys. My answer to this is kind of a cop-out. I'll be one of the first owners to take a tight end if one is available when I'm ready to draft a tight end. Like, I have a specific spot in my head where I say, okay, I'm ready to draft a tight end. And if it happens that someone like Gronk or Ertz or Graham or Ingram, one of those top 5 guys, is in that spot, great. Then I'll take one of the early tight ends. But I'm not reaching on any of these guys when there's so much flex running backs or receivers to be had, because that's usually where you start thinking about draft tight end, is after you've already have starters for your running backs and wide receivers. And when you really just compare the stats out, you're better off probably, filling up a flex spot or even maybe a bench running back spot before you reach for one of these tight ends.
Yeah, it does depend on your league, I guess. I kind of laughed when you said what you said, but that's true. I mean, if I'm feeling great about my team and it's the 9th round and Gronk's still there, I'll take him.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just not going to happen. I don't know. I have an unfair answer to this. I won't. There's no circumstance, none. I mean, no, there's none. It's just not. Honestly, it's just not the way I play. I don't think it's stupid to take Gronk. Like, I'm always secretly jealous of the guy that has the stones to grab Gronk, because I'm like, man, I don't. When I mock, I don't like what that does to the rest of my roster, because I view tight end as like, I'm just a streamer. It's just who I am as a player. So I ignore tight end. So I ignore the fact that I have Gronk, and that's not why you took him.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'll be willing to be the first to take a guy at any position, but it's got to be the right fit, the right time. Like last year, and a lot of this is just falling into it. But I scooped up Travis Kelce in like the 7th round, and at that point, I knew my running back position was set. I had a quarterback, I had some wide receivers. I might have still been in play for a flex, but I just had a feeling like Travis Kelce would be able to kind of set my team apart a little bit from some of the other teams versus, worrying about a flex or a wide receiver or, a third receiver or whatever. So it was just the right timing. And I had a good feeling about him. I had no idea he would have the season that he did. So that was all bonus. But I don't know. I don't rule anything out because there are times when you're going to be, looking at your team and looking at who's available and say, man, I really might have to pull the trigger on this player because, yeah, I mean, it's like it's not as appealing as getting another wide receiver, but this is a guy who's going to set himself apart at the position. It's an opportunity to, be that much better than a guy who, has to settle for Jack Doyle a couple rounds later. So,
yeah, I guess in large part that's about knowing your league too. I mean, you're talking about our shared league, and we're a league full of guys that are generally willing to wait at tight end. So, being the first guy in the 4th round is vastly different from you were probably the second one to take tight end in the 7th round. Right. So that I'll be one of the first in that situation.
Yeah, and I mean that kind of South, what you're saying right now plays directly into what I just said. Like you wouldn't have taken Kelce in the 4th or the 5th, but in the 7th it was the right time to grab him. Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. Is like you have to decide when it's time for you to roster a tight end, and if one of those top ones is there, great. I mean, another thing I do is when I'm doing my research on tight end, I tend to kind of fall in love with a guy who I think is going to wind up having a better year and maybe someone I know I can wait on. And then I know that I'm not going to address my tight end position until way later. And if it doesn't work out, then you're winding up streaming anyway, like Miles said. And if it does work out, then you have a position pretty much filled for the year without wasting a high draft pick on it. You know what I mean? So that's what I've done in years past. And sometimes it works out, and sometimes I wind up streaming. Sure. It's definitely a risk that you take.
And before you get to the next question, what's kind of fun about this isn't really addressed in one of your questions, so I'm going to throw it out there. What's kind of fun about being that streamer like I am this year is the way things are shaking out, both in drafts that I'm doing and lists that you see and everything, including our own list. Jordan Reed and Tyler Eifert are absolutely drafted for people like me who stream the heck out of tight ends.
Yep.
Well, trust me, I'm not banking on it, but if either of those guys plays 16, I'm just as good as the guys who took Kelce, Gronk, and Ertz. So, I mean, that's kind of the intriguing part of the tight end position for me this year is I can wait, and it's possible with health with Reed or Eifert, or maybe an insane breakout on Trey Burton. Like maybe I end up being the last guy in my league to take a tight end, and I have the best tight end in football.
Yeah.
It's possible.
Yeah,
it's never possible. This year it's kind of sort of possible.
I'll say this. If Jordan Reed plays 16 games, the world is going to end and fantasy won't matter anyway. So,
but at least I'm going to win my chip on the way out the door.
Right.
So,
yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And, we will talk a little bit more specifically about a tight ender here or two later on. But if you're not among the few to take a tight end at the top of this group, when do you typically address the position in a draft? Like a little bit more specifically, not so much so like when the feeling is right. Like what other positions do you feel like have to be addressed before you're going to get into that?
I don't know that I shouldn't say ever, because I'm 9 leagues plus every year, and it's a lot to remember, I guess. But I would be shocked the last time I took a tight end before every other starting spot on my team was filled, not including kicker and defense. So I have my quarterback, I have my backs, I have my receivers. I generally will have a couple bench guys. I'm thinking like 9th to 10th round is when I'm starting to consider tight end. But I know I'm typically one of the last, if not the last, every time to pick a tight end. And partly to kind of show my brain behind that, I think tight end more than any other position is really matchup dependent. So like last year, yes, you drafted Kelce and you were thrilled every week. So did everybody who took Gronk or Ertz. Good for you 3 in every league.
Sure.
But for me, if I just streamed, and obviously you can't do this every week, but if you just took the guy facing the Browns or Giants last year who couldn't stop the tight end for anything, you probably ended up as the best tight end team in your fantasy league. And God only knows who you had. It might have been Ricky Seals-Jones one week. It might have been a Vernon Davis thrown in here or a Vance McDonald. Like, who knows who you had? And it doesn't matter. I want 9 points if your guy gets 8. I don't care who it is. So I really like the stream based on matchups with that. I like Burton this year, but his stock's a little high. I'm kind of resigning in my brain to either the Reed or Eifert if I feel like it, or O.J. Howard or David Njoku in every league I'm in this year. And I just don't think it's that bad of a place to be.
Yeah.
Now, and like I said in the last question, if you get one of those 4 and it works out, then you're golden. And if it doesn't, then you're streaming, which you thought you were probably going to be anyway. I think a good place to start this is like round 7 or 8, and then obviously address it going forward. One of the big things I look at that place is like what their numbers look like versus the flex wide receivers that I would be taking at that point. You know what I mean? Not necessarily like, well, this guy's going to be tight end 4 and this, receiver is going to be receiver 25. Like, yeah, we get that. We understand that. But realistically, am I going to be better off by taking a flex receiver who's going to give me a better stat line on the season or at least on a weekly basis than I am taking the tight end at this point? And I kind of view that as my, all right, is it time or is it not time?
And that's not the argument, but discussion or whatever that I'll have with people who tell me you need to take a tight end in that situation. That's a great example because I think that's the way a lot of people think. And I'm not going to say it's wrong. It's just not the way I think. What I'm looking at, if I take tight end 8 or I wait 2 rounds to get tight end 11, what's the difference in point with those 2 guys versus the flex receiver I might draft in the 7th round versus the guy I then have to take in place in the 10th round? I think that gap is generally a lot larger between like receiver 25 and receiver. We might be talking 40.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
We might be talking 15 wide receiver gap versus a 3 tight end gap, when really at tight end 8, I'm taking Kyle Rudolph, who I like a lot every year. I've owned him a ton, as you can guess by the way I treat the position. Kyle Rudolph's kind of my guy, but is he really that different than Jack Doyle? Probably not now that Andrew Luck's back.
Okay.
So that's kind of what I look at is, 7th round's probably the right time to take a tight end, but my flex is usually better than other people's because I'll wait and take Doyle.
Well, that's why I made sure I very clearly said it's not the time to take a tight end. It's just time to start looking and comparing.
Yeah, and you should. And you should. And I'm going to say this a little later. Every draft plan you have. I mean, I'm sitting up here and I said it. This is our 3rd year doing this. And every year we do the tight end pod, I say wait and stream. But listen, I have to go into every draft with a totally fluid plan.
Yep.
And if, like South just said, if Travis Kelce falls to me in the 7th, that's not Kyle Rudolph anymore. That's Travis Kelce. Now I got to really think about that.
Yeah.
So, Rock, your wording was right. I mean, think about it. Don't marry yourself to 7th rounds. Want to take one.
Yep. And I would say just, to kind of put a button on this too, we're talking about marrying yourself to that thought process. And you brought up the good point of, being flexible on that. I think that goes both ways. Like you said, you have to be flexible that if the right guy falls to you, you're going to take it. But also, don't just get to the point where you feel like, all right, I've addressed my starters. I have a bench guy here, a bench guy there. Like I have to get a tight end here, whatever. Understand the drop off, at the position. Understand what players other owners in your league have taken. Make sure you're studying the board and how the rosters are breaking out. Know who still needs to take a tight end. Who's already got one, who might already have 2. Like we all have that guy in our league who's got 2 tight ends in the first 10 rounds. So, understand all those things, be aware of what's going on. It's super important when you're constructing your team here.
And one more piece to that, like let's say you are a tight end guy. And I think the fantasy community as a whole can agree it's Gronk, Kelce, and Ertz, and then a gap.
Yep.
Right. Well, if you're a tight end guy and you want one of those 3 and you're like, oh, my 4th round pick's going to be a tight end, and those 3 unexpectedly go, don't panic move and you have to have a tight end. And don't take Greg Olsen there. Don't take Evan Ingram there. You can wait. Again, it's all fluidity. It's all be willing to go off of your plan a little bit.
Yep. All right, let's talk about some ADP trends. We throw around these terms a lot. We don't want to assume that everybody knows what we're talking about. When we say ADP, we're talking about the average draft position right now. Um, a lot of this is based on the mocks that are going on right now, some pre-ranks and things like that. So we just took a couple bullet point things that are surprising right now that we wanted to highlight and discuss to prepare you for your draft coming up here, just so that you're not surprised by some of these trends. Alvin Kamara, he's been a point of contention amongst this group basically since
even right before we podcasted tonight.
Yeah, I mean, basically since the Saints left the playoffs and I started telling people I was going to take him in the first round. He and Saquon Barkley have moved ahead of Ezekiel Elliott and David Johnson in several pre-ranks on some notable sites. Do you think this is just trying to get ahead of the curve and some of those sites and pre-rankers wanting to be the person who calls it? Or do they really believe that their floors are better than Zeke and DJ?
I think yeah, go ahead, Rock.
You guys won't be surprised to hear my opinion on this. I think this is a clearly ahead of the curve thing. I mean, you're ranking them based at this point solely on upside. And upside is a great thing to rank on. But you can't tell me that you realistically think their floors are better than a guy who led the league in rushing and then still ran for 1,000 yards, even not rushing in 6 games, not playing for 6 games last year in Zeke. And DJ, who 2 years ago had 2,000 all-purpose yards, and last year would have had 2,000 all-purpose yards, except he broke his wrist in week 1. Like, you're talking about 2 of the best 4 backs in football, and you're ranking a guy who's had a great year last year. I'm not taking anything away from him, but the touchdown numbers were huge, and that was a huge factor of why he was so good.
Just say it. Regression. Just say it.
And then Saquon Barkley, who hasn't played a game and plays with a terrible offensive line. That should be better than last year, but it's still not great. So you're basically ranking 2 guys who have a ton of upside, which is fine. But to put them ahead of known commodities in Zeke and DJ, to me, seems silly. I think the latter 2 are definitely the safer pick.
So, shockingly, I'll disagree a bit.
Of course.
I have DJ third. I have Alvin next, then Zeke, then Saquon in my ranking. So I'm a little bit of a mix here, in large part to the fact that we rank half PPR. If you're half or full, I think Kamara's catches do overcome some of what Zeke potentially has on the ground. Standard, Zeke, DJ are definitely in my top 4. Standard, Zeke might be my number 1 player. So, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, I'll answer this 2 ways. Number 1, I think in a lot of ways, this is July tinkering to an extent. I mean, all this ADP data and stuff we have is from major fantasy nerds. Like, your casual player is not messing around yet. So some of this, like for me, I'm 30 couple mocks in on Yahoo. I'm not taking the same players every time. Nerd. I want to see what happens. Well, hey, I've never hidden my colors. We all know what this is. But, like, there are times I'm taking Kamara first to see what my team ends up being. Am I going to do that in 4 weeks? No. He's not my number 1 player, so it's not going to happen. So some of that is nerds with their July tinkering and seeing what your team ends up being. Some of it's this ADP data is coming from MFLs or other best ball stuff. And I can see why people might think that Kamara or Barkley have the higher ceiling weeks. I don't agree with them versus Johnson or Zeke, but I can kind of see that. The other thing I think it might be is the excitement of, boy, what if we didn't see Kamara's ceiling last year and that was just kind of what he could be, and now we're getting a month more play out of him? What if Saquon Barkley does come in and take the world on fire? Amazing. And then that recency bias of last year, Zeke, people think was just okay last year. He was still incredible. He ran, like Rock just said, he ran for almost 100 yards a week when he was in, and he's not going to be suspended this year. And people have just forgotten about David Johnson. We're at, like, discussions I'm having with people are treating David Johnson like he's just some old guy who's spent.
Right.
Like, it's his 4th year. He missed last year. Oh, well, we don't know if he's going to get hurt. He dislocated his wrist. This isn't an ACL. To be banging on David Johnson makes less than 0 sense to me. He was the number 1 fantasy back just 2 years ago, and he could have come back last Thanksgiving. And the Cardinals just said, why bother?
Yeah, it's a freak thing. And like just to kind of play devil's advocate here, though, like, and I want to highlight too that you brought up the exact reason why we're having this conversation, because a lot of this is people are tinkering. So people are going to see, oh man, Kamara is like fourth overall right now in drafts. I need to reevaluate or whatever. Maybe to an extent, but also understand that, like you said, that's a lot of tinkering. That's not necessarily indicative of what people really truly believe. It could just be more like you said, I'm taking Kamara 3 to see what my team looks like, or I'm going to take Saquon 2 because I'm a Giants fan. I want to see what my team looks like, whatever. So, but just to play devil's advocate here, is it unrealistic to think like those two guys could be in a better position? Maybe not so much Saquon Barkley, but especially Kamara. Like they could be in a better position to put up points with their offense, because you look at the Cowboys on paper, at least their offense isn't as good as last year. And the Cardinals, they've had some wholesale changes to their offense, a brand new coach, which we're going to get into later. Like, you know, maybe it's not that far fetched to think like they could just be in better situations.
It's you know what, like I'm going to go back to a point I made before. It's not that I think that they're not in worse situations, but to me to pre-rank them higher is kind of like what you said, is assuming that their floors are higher, and I don't think that's the case. Like, I honestly, we don't know. We don't have any idea what Saquon's floor could be. It could be 700 yards and 2 touchdowns. You know, we don't know how the Giants are going to use him yet. We don't know what the Giants' offense is going to look like. Like, do I think that's the case? Absolutely not. But it could be. But Ezekiel Elliott's floor is 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns. Like, that's his floor. You know what I mean? So to rank Saquon or AK above those other two, and that would be a horrible year.
1,010 would be atrocious. Maybe 10,
this is a guy that's averaging 100 yards a game that he plays in, rushing.
Right.
Over 100 yards rushing per game that he plays in.
We want to talk about how bad Dallas, like, he hasn't rushed that well because of Dez Bryant in 2016 and 17.
No.
Like, they haven't been a good passing team the last several years. They're efficient because of Zeke. Sure. I don't know. I hear you, South, and I know you were devil's advocate. It's not necessarily what you believe. I mean, it's unquestionable that Alvin Kamara is in the best situation. He's on the best offense. His team is going to score the most points of these 4. But, and on the flip side of that, Zeke and DJ are their offense. Now, there's enough that you can't just only pay – if you only pay attention to David Johnson, like Fitzgerald's going to kill you. So there's enough on those teams that you have to watch. They're not in the same situation as the Saints. And like Rock, to your point, I think we do know how the Giants are going to use Barkley. We'll see if it works. They're going to give him the ball a ton. You don't draft a guy, too, to like timeshare him with Wayne Gallman.
No, I understand that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, like,
we're hedging bets here. The truth is, like, any of these 4 guys could finish the RB1 this year, and I won't be surprised.
Yeah.
Any of them fall off, I will be surprised, but we never know. I think this is July tinkering. When push comes to shove, from expert drafts all the way down to first year, Zeke and DJ should ultimately be drafted ahead of Saquon. We'll see how you feel about Kamara to plug him in there, but it doesn't make any sense for DJ to not be the number 3 player here for me.
Right. All right, so let's talk about Evan Ingram. Last year, he finished as tight end 5, and he's right now being drafted in round 7 on average, which is, you know, probably high in our opinion, but behind guys like Greg Olsen and Jimmy Graham. Is this an oversight by fantasy owners, or maybe we a little bit turned off by him now that Beckham is back and Saquon is in the picture?
Yeah, I think you just nailed it. I think it might be a major oversight, to be totally honest. And what you just said is why. I mean, the case against Ingram is the combination of there's plenty of weapons in New York with, you know, you said Odell coming back. Saquon's there now. Sterling Shepard's really good. I mean, you're silly if you think he's not. And then a bad-ish offensive line, which you might say, oh, what does that matter for the tight end? Well, the line might not allow you to take advantage of all those weapons all the time. So that, you know, obviously line doesn't block for the tight end necessarily, but it does block for the quarterback to have time to find him. That being said, Evan Ingram's a monster. I mean, he finished tight end 5 last year and didn't even get going week 1. I mean, it was a while till he was really taking over. So he's really good. I don't have a major issue with Greg Olsen being ahead of him. I'm not a huge believer in Jimmy Graham on a new team. I don't think he should be ahead of Ingram ever. And I just went off about being the last guy in my league. If Evan Ingram's there in the 7th round for me, that's going to be so tempting. So tempting.
Yeah.
Oh, so
because I think at the end of the season, it's very likely he'll be in there with those top 3 for next year's draft.
Yeah, I wouldn't be shocked.
I'd be shocked only because you just said like you're going to give Saquon the ball a ton, and he's not going to outperform OBJ. So really, at best, it's a 3rd option type of deal, maybe a 4th behind Sterling. My big thing with it is I said that I kind of understand him being drafted behind at least someone like Jimmy Graham because Jimmy's playing with Aaron Rodgers, and like that's a difference maker. The level of difference right now between Aaron Rodgers and Eli Manning is like a billion, and that might be understating it. Okay, I'm not saying that Jimmy Graham is better than Evan Ingram at this point in their careers. I don't think that he is.
What I heard.
But
it's good.
I'll fight you. But realistically, you're looking at a situation where Aaron Rodgers does like to throw to the tight end. He's definitely going to.
I don't know where that ever came from. Like they had a year where Richard Rodgers had like 500 yards. But outside of that,
because he throws.
Martellus Bennett failed there big time.
Yep.
Like it's been since Jermichael Finley since he cared. Aaron Rodgers throws to his wide receivers. I don't understand where the Rodgers tight end thing came from.
Because he does throw to the tight end, especially in the red zone. It's just
not especially in the red zone. His wide receivers score 12 to 14 red zone touchdowns a year, not as a group, individually. He does not throw to the tight end in the red zone. He doesn't. He throws to Devontae Adams.
He doesn't throw to one, but Richard Rodgers and I mean, even to an extent, like you can say that it's not, but like Jeff Janis winds up like right on the end of the. But when they use him in that position, yeah, Quincy Enunwa was not a tight end either. But when you line him up at the end of the line, he's playing in that tight end slot. Like that's what they are. They're bigger body guys, and no, they don't have a tight end who has 10 touchdowns, but they haven't had that caliber tight end.
But with the lack of Jimmy Graham's ability in the middle of the field anymore, doesn't he have to score 10 touchdowns to be relevant? And this guy, he doesn't move well anymore, especially not compared to Evan Ingram.
No, I'm not. Like I said, I'm not saying he's better than Evan Ingram.
Okay, but you're saying he should be ranked ahead. So tell me this: true or false? Evan Ingram should gain, if all things go well, 300 to 400 yards more than Jimmy Graham this year. Maybe 400 is a bit much. 300.
I think even 300 is a bit much for a number 4 target on an offense.
An offense that's going to have to throw a lot. Could you see 400 to 700 yards?
400 to 7?
400 for Jimmy, 700 for Evan. If so, that's 5 touchdowns difference.
Yeah. And we're kind of leaving out the biggest difference here is the actual red zone aspect of it. Like when you look at what the Packers do when they get into the red zone, that's, typically
receivers, man.
It's typically been running backs and receivers, and it's usually the same receiver. We noticed it the last couple of years where he finds a guy that he trusts in the red zone and he goes to him. Evan Ingram in every game that he started last year had a red zone target. So, I mean, I know that you didn't convert every single one of those, but in every game that he started last year for the Giants, he had a red zone target. Which is, there's something to be said there. He's developing a chemistry with Eli. Again, no Beckham, but still
that hurts a ton.
Right.
I'm on the Ingram bandwagon. It's not because I think he'll have 8 to 9 touchdowns. I think 700 yards is a floor for him. So if he gives me 700 yards and 4, no, I don't get a ton of great weeks out of him, but I get consistent play. The big fear as a tight end player like I am is the 2 catch for 13-yard week without the touchdown.
Sure.
And that's not going to be an Evan Ingram stat line. That could be a Jimmy stat line.
It has been a Jimmy stat line.
Right. And we talk about Aaron Rodgers. He's playing with Russell Wilson, who isn't Aaron Rodgers, but he's still a top 5 thrower in the game.
Yep, for sure. All right, we're going to move on from Evan Ingram so we don't basically claw each other's eyes out here. But let's talk about
the worst part of that whole thing is we ignored Greg Olsen, who's coming back and has been Cam Newton's favorite receiver since Steve Smith left.
Yep.
So,
Yep. I mean, you did say that you weren't that surprised that
no.
Greg Olson's going ahead of him, and I don't think we really are, but we're just talking based on last year's data. So, listen, Jerick McKinnon right now is trending at 2.09, ahead of Jordan Howard, LaShawn McCoy, Joe Mixon, and backs in that grouping. So give me your gut feeling on the price of Jerick McKinnon as he's trending right now. Is it too high? Is it too low? Is it just right? Three little bears here.
I think this is a great four-person group to actually judge this on, because I think like this entire group, I don't want to say it's a crapshoot, but like you have one player who is just extremely boring with no top end value, just consistent number 10 player every week in Jordan Howard. You have one guy in Shady who's, for all purposes, on his way out. I mean,
we don't know if he's ever going to touch the ball again.
No, exactly. So, and then you have two guys in McKinnon and Mixon who have very high ceilings, but we've yet to see it. Right. So, this group right here, if you have a top back and you want to play, you already have a top back, like let's say Todd, okay, and now you want to play the I'm taking a risk game, then you go Mixon or you go McKinnon. If you have a lower pick and you want, a consistent player, then you take Howard. You know what I mean? But this whole group right here, I think McKinnon is in the right spot within this group. It's just kind of like what Miles says all the time. How do you play? Do you play for risk or do you play for safety?
Yeah, and I think also to add on to that, I said the same thing a couple times tonight, which I guess just means I'm telling the truth. But this could also be a lot of ADP data based on some best ball stuff. So, I mean, McKinnon's unknown, but he may well be a better best ball pick than any of these other three for sure. Because, like you said, Rock Howard is not going to have a ton of huge weeks, except for the ones he may score 2 touchdowns from time to time. Great. It totally makes sense ahead of Shady if you're drafting at this point. And I think Mixon and McKinnon are probably the same amount of question mark as far as their roles and the newness to them. But McKinnon's got the better offensive mind behind him, at least. I think we've covered already, and a lot of people are really excited to see how Kyle Shanahan uses him. So that makes a lot of sense. I think when season-long drafts kick off, we may see that flip a little bit, especially with Jordan Howard. Jordan Howard's just – it's a shame. We cover him a lot, and it's just a pity that you really can't rank him higher than he's being drafted and where he's ranked, because he's not a 1,700-yard back. He's not going to have a ton of receptions. He's also not an 800-yard back, so he's got to be on your team. But it feels like he's a guy we already said is just right, and I think McKinnon, in a sense, is as well, because he belongs with that guy. I think his total yardage expectation is higher, but we just don't know what he is. I mean, Howard's the only guy here we really know what he is.
Yeah, I think this is just right, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. Carlos Hyde last year, almost 1,300 total yards from scrimmage. We understand that Kyle Shanahan wants to use the back and get those all-purpose yards. I think we all agree that McKinnon is a more athletic back than Carlos Hyde. The question is his durability. He's never been the guy before. But we also shouldn't count that against him either, because he's got fresher legs than a lot of guys who would move from one team to another at this point too. So, it's a lot of unknown, I guess, in that regard, but I don't see another back behind him that scares me. Like, who's going to steal away touches from him in different situations? It's not going to be Matt Breida. Like, I mean, as much as those are nice players, it's just none of those names typically scare me or are ready to jump into a position where they're taking away, touches or situations. So I think he'll be a 3-down back. I think he's going to have plenty of opportunity. I think he's going to have a chance to pile up yardage. My only question would be, can he do it for 16 games as the guy? So, and I would tend to lean yes at this point, just based on gut. So I do think that it's just right as far as where he is right now.
Yeah, and it's funny, the phrase you just used, he's never been the guy, can be viewed as a positive or a negative.
Right.
He's never been the guy, so we've never seen him do it. But he's shown flashes, and now he has a chance to be the guy. I just like I like the Shanahan part so much. I mean, you could go back to remember when Steve Slayton was a thing.
Yeah.
Like Kyle Shanahan was that offensive coordinator when Steve Slayton had over 1,600 total yards. So we always want to talk about he used Carlos Hyde. Yes, that's true. He used Devonta Freeman a ton. Yes, that's true. All the way back, I mean, Steve Slayton was a thing because of Kyle Shanahan. So
I don't want to be the negative
good player.
I don't want to be the negative Nancy in this group, but
you will.
But here we go.
Devonta Freeman was a thing, but so was Tevin Coleman. Carlos Hyde finished number 8 last year in our fantasy settings. Matt Breida had 125 touches. So, I don't think that, it's a guarantee that McKinnon – I think it's a guarantee that McKinnon will be the starter and that he'll play the Freeman role or the Hyde role from last year, and he'll probably play it better. But to think that, Sal, just to disagree with you, to think that Matt Breida is not going to get at least some of the action here and there, especially if McKinnon has weeks where he looks ineffective, that's
of course Breida is going to get the ball, but you're only strengthening McKinnon's argument because while Breida got 125 touches, Carlos Hyde was a top 10 back when Tevin Coleman was a thing. Devonta Freeman finished RB1 a couple years ago in the whole league. So I mean, the way Shanahan likes to use his backs, you don't have to have an Ezekiel Elliott workload. You can split time, but he just puts his guys in such great positions that you're still getting a ton of fantasy points out of that lead back.
All right, guys, keep getting those fantasy football questions into us. If you're watching live with us on YouTube here, you could send them across to us. We'll answer some right after we talk to you about our friends at Gorb. We talk about Gorb all the time, and you may wonder, what in the world is Gorb? And you might see the hashtag GHORBH. Well, it stands for Get Hungry or Be Hungry. And the mission and the kind of the focus behind Gorb is to remind you that in life, you've got two choices. You can either get hungry or be hungry. And it's just such a good statement for just about everything in life. You could always be that person that wished that you would have gone for it, or wished that you would have taken that step to maybe approach that career or try that new thing. Or you could be the person who doesn't do it and always wished that you did, and you just always hungry instead. Gorb is kind of taking over social media. I saw today just a ton of posts out there with the hashtag Gorb, highlighting just some great things that different people are doing out in their communities that got hungry instead of being hungry. Check them out at gorb.com, GHORBH.com. You could tell them that we sent you. They've got all kinds of great gear to give you that reminder. It looks good. It feels good. They've got all kinds of styles, designs, colors, men, women, kids. They've got it all covered. Gorb.com, GHORBH.com. All right, it is fantasy Q&A time here on the podcast, and we enjoy getting your fantasy football questions. So keep sending them in. If you're watching live on YouTube right now, if you listen to the show after the fact, feel free to send them in on social media as well. We won't be exclusive to just answering questions on the podcast. We answer them throughout the week on Facebook and on Twitter as well. So here's the first question that we got here. How heavily should the offensive line weigh on your decision to draft a running back? As an example, guy we've been talking about, Devonta Freeman, who has a pretty good line versus a Kareem Hunt who does not have as good of a line. Do you guys take into account the offensive line situation there with players who are in a similar tier like that?
Within similar tiers to an extent, yes, I do. I kind of, what I jotted down here is for elite level backs, I don't think it matters as much. I'm going to use this example, and I pulled it up from a couple of years ago. 2 years ago, when Zeke led the league in rushing as a rookie, he had the number one graded offensive line in the league. Well, David Johnson finished as RB1 that year, and he had the 24th ranked offensive line graded out. You know what I mean? So when you're talking about these elite level backs, Lev, Zeke, even down a little bit, Melvin Gordon, Kareem Hunt type guys, it matters. I don't think it matters all that much. I think the spot that you start looking at that is when you start talking about those 11 through 20 backs and lower. What do their offensive lines look like in terms of how I'm ranking them and who I'm going to draft one or another. When your top 10 backs, they're top 10 backs for a reason. Like, they're special type players.
Yeah, it's once you get into that tier where guys aren't creating their own yards as much, then obviously it matters.
Yeah, and I mostly agree, with what you guys are saying here. I think that we are in a place in the league where it doesn't matter as much because guys, like you said, Miles, they can create their own openings, their own, offensive play callers are getting creative. If your guys can't block and move a guy, 2-3 yards off the ball, well, let's get them in space and use their athletic ability and create leverage that way. And, now with scoring with PPR, like, could be a guy who might go for 800 combined yards this year, but he's going to catch 60 balls. So there's value in that. So, I don't take it into account quite as much unless it's just an absolute disaster of a situation. Like last year, when I looked at what the Giants were bringing to the table, that was a avoid at all costs situation, but they didn't have a dynamic back, coming in like Saquon Barkley. So it was a little easier to do that, but I don't put a ton of stock in it.
That's a double dip thing. It was really easy to say, oh, I don't want to touch the Giants running situation. Well, obviously,
right.
You didn't want Paul Perkins that badly. I got to be honest, I don't really use it at all. I don't look at it in the same form that I don't really look at strength schedule stuff. I mean, I'll look at it. I'm lying there, but it's not part of my stuff I have open on draft day. I think it's just kind of something a little bit in the back of your mind. Ultimately, the only reason I use it is a tiebreaker. If there's two guys I like exactly the same, one has a better line, and take it, or one has a quote unquote easier schedule. And I always scoff at the strength of schedule stuff. Like, was going into last year, everybody was in love with Jacksonville's defense, right?
Yep.
No, going into last year,
I was.
Oh, okay. But we can't move the ball on them in love with it.
No.
All right, you know what I mean? And now all of a sudden I'm being told I have to fear Jacksonville. Every matchup with Jacksonville, watch it. I got to downgrade AFC South players because they got Jacksonville twice. Yeah, it's probably true, but in the same sense, like maybe we're all being like, yeah, target the guys playing the Skins. And then all of a sudden Washington's a top 3 defense this year. You don't know. Yeah. So it's the same thing as the line. What if some unknown, usually trash right tackle becomes I'm not basing my decision in August on stuff I don't know.
Sure.
I'm going to do it as much on what I know as possible.
Yep. All right, next question here. Because running backs are going so fast in the first round this year, and again, that's just the current trend. We're not speaking from – none of us have actually drafted yet other than a best ball. How soon should I address wide receiver in a PPR league?
Again, going with a loose plan. So whatever we say, whatever anybody says, it shouldn't be a rule. Like so my goal, 10 to 12 teams, I kind of shared this with you guys last night because I was doing a mock. And I want to leave the first 2 rounds with a running back and a receiver. I like that it doesn't force my hand for my next pick. And then I do this mock last night, and I'm drafting 8th out of 10. And I get Barkley, and then in the second round, Melvin Gordon's sitting there. So I took Melvin Gordon. Right. Obviously, I wanted a receiver, but I'm not going to pass on Melvin. So ultimately, first off, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, it depends on what comes to you. I love leaving the first 2 rounds with one. If you're a first-round receiver guy, great, get one. Just make sure you try to get a running back in the second. But the thing to be really careful about here is the PPR league thing. I really like the quote that a rising tide raises all boats. So,
getting deep.
You like that? I throw that out at you. What I mean by that is like PPR. Yes, individual players get a boost there. Duke Johnson's a way better player in PPR than he is in standard, obviously. What I'm saying is let that affect your running back rankings or your receiver rankings. But don't draft a receiver earlier because you play in a PPR, because every receiver is going to get more points in a PPR. So whether you draft one in the second or third, they're getting more points. It's the same thing as like people freak out about quarterbacks in a 6-point touchdown league. No, every quarterback's getting 6 points. They're all the same value as each other. Just because they score more points, don't let it affect how you draft. If you think running backs are more important than receivers, take one, regardless of your settings.
Yeah. And it's important to note too, like with the PPR, there are so many backs now who have benefited from the PPR. You know, you brought up Duke Johnson. You know, he's comparable to a lot of these wide receivers that are out there that you would be considering at that point. You know, you've got guys like Alvin Kamara who we don't even know what their upside is catching the ball. You know, Lev Bell, and it's obviously, you know, an extreme example there because he's going to be at the top of a draft, but like you don't have to be forced into jumping on a wide receiver because there are so many backs now who are going to catch 55, 60, 65 balls where it's not going to be as relevant to you. So, you know, I like how you put it. Have a general plan, but be willing to adapt to what's happening in your draft. You know, you don't necessarily. Here's a perfect example. If you're coming to a late third round pick and Jordan Howard is sitting there, but you know, so is a guy like Keenan Allen. You're playing a PPR.
Well, I got to be in that league.
Well, I'm throwing.
I know. That is, wow.
But like, you've got a wide receiver out there who's going to catch a lot of balls versus a running back who's going to be so consistent, but not really hit you with that PPR side. You know, you got to understand how your team looks at that point, what other teams look like to make that decision. So that's where I think it could become a tough decision.
Yeah, the one thing I wrote down is that if you're doing this right, you need to leave the first 3 rounds with 2 and 1. I don't really care what the order is, you know, or how you get there, but you need to leave, you know, with 2 running backs and 1 wide receiver, or 1 running back and 2 wide receivers. You can't take. I don't think there is a such thing as taking one too early. Like if you're the guy who wants to take AB in the end of the first round or the middle of the first round, be my guest. But then don't ignore the running back position for the next 2 rounds. Like that's what Miles means when he means changing your plan and being fluid. If you had a plan to take a running back, but then you decide to take AB, okay, fine. But that means that now you're kind of not forced to, but you need to be looking at what running backs are going to fall to you over the next 2 rounds because you can't leave the first 3 rounds without a top tier running back.
Let's get a couple more in here. We kind of touched on this one a little bit not too long ago. How does a new head coach or offensive coordinator to a team affect a player's fantasy value, in your opinion?
Can a lot. I mean, it's funny. It's kind of like you said something earlier, you know, not being the guy can be a positive or negative. Well, so can a new coach, obviously, be a positive or negative. We saw just last year what Kyle Shanahan did. Now, obviously, when Jimmy G came in, it really changed. But that San Francisco offense was a force. And then the big one, obviously, is the Rams. You go from Jeff Fisher to Sean McVay, and everybody got better on the entire offense. I mean, everybody put up better numbers than they had the prior year. So that is huge. Where it gets scary is a situation like Arizona. And I still like a lot of Cardinals. But you're going from Bruce Arians, who's, I mean, one of the better offensive minds, air it out, loves to be explosive, throw it downfield, which opened things up underneath for David Johnson. And now we've got Steve Wilkes there. I don't know what that team's going to be. So I think more than saying does it raise or lower guys because they have a new coach, look at that specific situation and care enough to look back the last 2-3 years. Like we should have seen the Rams coming a little bit because the Skins offense was pretty good under Sean McVay.
Sure.
They put up numbers. So we should have seen that coming. So when we have a new coach, where did he come? Defensive guy. Well, he's got a new offensive coordinator. So where did that guy come from? What did that look like? The Colts should be better. They got the Eagles offensive coordinator instead of Chuck Pagano. I mean, they should put up better numbers because you've got Frank Reich coming in. So definitely. I'll use that way more than the offensive line or the strength of schedule thing. Way more.
So isn't Steve Wilkes the bald security guy from the Jerry Springer show?
It's possible. It's possible.
I could have sworn that's the guy's name.
Doppelganger for sure.
Yeah, it's Steve Wilco, but
okay.
that's where
I was close. I was close.
Yeah, I'm looking at it not just from an offensive standpoint, but also from the reverse. Like, which team hired a defensive guy to be their head coach? You know, we'll look at a team like the Lions. You know, who now have Matt Patricia at the helm. Now, listen, I'm not going to look negatively upon Matthew Stafford because I still think he's a fantastic quarterback. But philosophies do change when you hire defensive guys. Listen, I remember what it was like to hire Rex Ryan and as a Jets fan and be playing in an offense that is super duper outdated for this time of the year. Those are things
that was a Brian Schottenheimer thing as much as anything. So.
Well, yes, but it was a Rex Ryan ground and pound hiring of Brian Schottenheimer, who all he knew was his dad's offense, and that's fine. But like those are things you have to look at. Like that's why you look at it and say, okay, well, I like the Jets running backs in this situation. Thomas Jones at that time was a top fantasy running back, but you can't draft their quarterback. Their receivers are almost undraftable at that point. So those are things you have to look at both ways. Like, yes, this guy got a great offensive coordinator, but this team hired a defensive head coach. Right. Well, how is their scheme going to change? How does that negatively affect their players?
And just to clarify, I know you use the Lions just as an example, but Jim Bob Cooter is still the
yes,
But also to Rocco's point, like, is Matt Patricia going to swallow his pride enough to say, "Hey, JBC, you've got the offense"?
I think you have to. I mean, that's a proven commodity, but we don't know.
But not all guys do that. I mean, that's a big Matt Patricia is finally the man.
Not all guys do that, and he's coming from the land where his former head coach never did that. To an extent.
He'll be too busy eating his mustache anyway.
Nice.
I mean, that's what he does.
Choose on that.
All right, let's talk about another question here. How do you view middle of the road running backs here when you're comparing a timeshare back who's a better player versus maybe a player who's not as good but has a clearly defined role? Maybe a good example here would be like a Tevin Coleman versus an Isaiah Crowell, who, in theory should be the lead back there. Or, maybe that's an extreme example because Coleman gets so many touches still, but that's the basic point that we're getting at here with the question. How do you view or prioritize that? Do you go with the more talented player with a lesser role, or maybe the less talented player with more of a role?
South, can I quote you here?
You can quote me.
All right. I love when you let me quote you. Volume is king.
Yes, it is.
Listen, I love, and this might be a bad example because I love a guy like Tevin Coleman, and even as a Jets fan, I don't really know how I feel about Crowell. But generally speaking, I want a back who's going to be a lead horse back and get 200 plus touches or even approaching 300 touches versus a guy who's in a timeshare, even if he's the better player. We all know Tevin Coleman's better than Isaiah Crowell, but as the lead dog, could Isaiah Crowell wind up with a 1,000-yard rushing season? Possibly 8 or 9 touchdowns? Yeah, absolutely. And I know that he's going to get the touches. At least it looks that way right now. Like I said, this might be a bad example because, we don't really know how the Jets are going to unfold at this point. But generally speaking, when you're talking about that, I want volume.
I actually think it's a pretty great example based on what we just saw this week with Elijah McGuire going down.
Yeah.
Crowell's even more a feature back now.
Yep.
So, I mean, that looks a lot like a two-man backfield with clearly defined roles to me, with Bilal coming in for passing downs, obviously getting some carries, and vice versa, Crowell being an early down and getting some catches. And I kind of, as much as I hate to agree with both of you, because that's generally a recipe for boredom and disaster, both.
Hey,
I do like, in that situation, I do like Crowell because he is good to be good, but he could trip into 1,000. Look at C.J. Anderson last year. He was a lead back. He fell into 1,000 yards. That can happen. So I guess ultimately it might depend how talented this timeshare is. Like Alvin Kamara was in a timeshare. How good is this guy in a timeshare? If he's clearly lights out better, with the way football is changing, that can still be a great fantasy commodity. If for no reason, then there are so many timeshares that it's almost hard in the middle rounds to miss out on a timeshare. So ultimately, yeah, it's nice to weigh the two options that this listener gave us, but I'd rather have the really talented timeshare back over the not as talented timeshare back in a different team. I mean, that's kind of a stupid way to say it, but that's usually the draft decision you're making.
Yeah. I mostly agree. And I think we just threw out that example based on the question that we got, but you look at a guy like Lamar Miller, who by all accounts should have a ton of volume. There's if you throw the history there that you might have been burned by him, whatever, out, and you compare him to a guy like a CJ Anderson or like a Dion Lewis, like those are tougher decisions that you're going to have to make. Do you go with the 300 potential carries versus the upside of the talented player there? So I guess it's a good problem to have to decide it. So, but I mean, I would tend to lean toward the volume. I've said that a lot. A lot of people have stolen that over the last couple of years, but I'm all about the volume. So they're not creating any more touches. So when you have them, it's a great commodity to have. So, and unless you're a total train wreck of a player, it's hard to turn that into just nothing. You have to basically be Jeremy Hill.
It's a great problem to have, but it's not a great problem to be forced into as a drafter. I'll say that too. Like I'd love to make the Isaiah Crowell versus, I mean, we'll use Coleman. We'll keep using it. I'd love to make that decision for either a flex or bonus as a first bench player.
Sure.
I don't want to make that call as my RB2 at all.
No.
But one more thing on this, you will see this question kind of reflected in our rankings a little bit. Our new ranking, our new release just came out on Thursday. I mean, you just brought up Lamar Miller. Deal and I both moved him into the top 16 because the more news comes out from Houston, Deonta Foreman's not going to be ready. So as much as neither one of us is going to tell you he's that great of a player, he's going to get the ball a ton on a pretty good offense. So I want that guy.
Yeah. And I just mentioned too how I want the volume unless it's a train wreck. I think Lamar Miller is basically Jeremy Hill 2.0.
Yeah,
that's just my personal opinion.
But Watson to Hopkins and Fuller is not Andy Dalton.
No.
But even I don't know if AJ Green is Hopkins.
Well, even
definitely better than anybody else they had. So it's a better offense as a whole.
Yeah.
Let's use the same team as an example. Watkins to Hopkins and Fuller is better than Brock to Hopkins and nobody.
Right.
So like the whole team around him is getting better.
Yeah. Well, listen, this has been a fun show tonight to get the questions. Keep them rolling in.
Yeah.
As we mentioned on social media, we love to answer them. We'll answer them, over the next couple of weeks as well on the show. We appreciate interaction. That's what we want to have with you guys. So make sure you're keeping it locked into footballgoons.com. You can get involved on the fantasy message board as well. Lineup advice, fantasy conversation, question and answer areas, everything that you could need for a fantasy football community. We've got it at footballgoons.com. Check us out at facebook.com/footballgoons and at footballgoons on the Twitter. We're also live here every single Sunday night for now until the season starts when we adjust, which we'll get into more over the next couple of weeks. We'll be live here on our YouTube channel as well. So you could like, subscribe, comment to the videos as well, and check out the show each and every Sunday night. Next week, one of our favorite shows of the entire year, our live fantasy mock draft. We've got a new wrinkle for you this year. We're not going to spoil it just quite yet, but we think it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to create some tension in the room.
It's going to be a nightmare.
I'll give a teaser. It's going to be fun for two of us.
Yeah, and then two of us are basically going to fist fight virtually. So, yeah, but listen, it's going to be a lot of fun. You're going to want to check it out. We're going to do it live in real time. So if you've not mocked yet or you want to be a part of a live mock, you're going to want to check it out next week. Same time, same channel. So until then, we'll catch you guys next time.